Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning. We're excited to have you. Today, you are at the Oregon Realtors Member Benefit webinar, The Better Way to Talk About Schools. And just a few quick notes for technical support. Always remember that we have the free tech helpline for all members, and that phone number is listed on the screen. If you ever have any technical issues of any kind during any part of your day, you're always welcome to call the tech helpline. That is a member benefit to you. If you are asking any questions, you're welcome to ask questions throughout this presentation. Please use the chat to send to all presenters. And if you have registered for this webinar, your CE is being processed. You will receive an email with instructions on how to log in and access your CE certificate within the next 2 weeks. So with that, I am very excited to introduce our guest today. With us, we have Rebecca Jacobson from PhD at the Teachers College of Columbia University. She is a professor of education, politics, and policy at the College of Education at Michigan State University. She has written extensively about accountability policies, local school politics, school board elections, whether and how schools prepare the next generations of citizens for active engagement in the democratic process. Her book, Grading Education, Getting Accountability Right, was co-authored with Richard Rothstein and Tamara Wilder Linkow, and won a book award from the American School Board Association. We are very excited to have Rebecca here with us today. And with that, I will turn it over to Rebecca. Thank you.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all. I do really welcome questions and want to be responsive to the things that are on your mind and making this useful to you. So feel free to throw questions in the chat and they'll get them to me, and we can field those as they come up. So don't feel like you have to wait until the very end. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And so I'm going to be talking about the relationship between buying homes and buying schools, and the ways that these things historically have been linked, some of the consequences of that, and especially getting to the way that school ratings and the ways that those have become linked to the home buying process are continuing to shape housing segregation. So my plan for today is to go over these following areas. I always start sort of with how did we get here, just because I'm always surprised at how many people, though you may be far savvier than the typical person, is about how we got to this segregated state. Then a little bit about where we are now. Then I'll really start digging into what do these test scores tell us? So what do we know about how great schools comes up with their scores? What are the different kinds of scores that they're using? And how do they package them together? Then we'll talk about what we know about how these ratings get used in housing choices by families, by home buyers. And then at the end, we'll talk about how we can make a difference. And I've got some ideas, but I would love to field your questions and input there as well. So just to get us started, I want to do just a very short history of the systematic and sanctioned residential segregation. And I think this is really important. And I want to stress sort of the sanctioned and systematic aspects of this, because for many people, this has been a forgotten history. Certainly, we assume that there were a few bad actors, that this was a case of individuals. And I think most people don't realize the extent to which the federal government, state, and local governments contributed to this, and not only allowed it, but actually sanctioned it and sometimes furthered it. So the four things that I'll just talk quickly about are neighborhood association restrictive covenants, block busting, homeowners loan corporation, which is where we got redlining from, and then Federal Housing Administration loans. So restrictive covenants, you guys may be very familiar with these because they're still sometimes on people's deeds to their home, but they are no longer legal. But when they were initially done, the deed could restrict who you could sell your home to. And here's an example of what one would have stated. These were ruled illegal in 1948, but nonetheless, they had already begun to have an impact on the segregation that was occurring. So you can see here that no property in said edition shall at any time be sold, conveyed, rented, or leased in whole or any part to any person or persons not of the white or Caucasian race. So your neighbors could actually hold you legally to this clause in your deed. You may be familiar with real estate agent practices that were taking advantage of an influx of African Americans looking for housing. And so real estate agents and developers would use scare tactics to really, as you can see here, develop panic selling. This is an article out of the Michigan newspaper. And they would use strategies such as hiring two African American boys to act out a fight, right? Which people wouldn't know was an act. And so they would assume, oh my goodness, who's moving into this neighborhood? Or they would pay a woman to walk a baby carriage, an African American woman to walk a baby carriage around. Developers would sometimes buy land and leave it unoccupied, right? Buy a house and leave it unoccupied to convey the impression that this was a declining neighborhood. All of this fear was meant to encourage people to sell. And because there was such demand by African Americans, it was very easy to turn around and sell these homes at a much higher rate. And the reason why it was called blockbusting is because you could rapidly turn a neighborhood from sort of a stable white neighborhood or even a stable diverse neighborhood into an African American, more unstable enclave. This is actually a map of a redlining map that was used in Philadelphia. So you can see here that it says on the right-hand side, red is hazardous. So these maps were created and used first by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, then by Federal Housing Administration, and then by the Veterans Administration. And I always tell my students that, you know, it's hard to imagine there was a time when people had to pay cash for their entire home purchase. We so often just use home loans like it's what everybody has done and always has done. However, prior to the federal government offering the mortgage insurance backing, right, people had to buy the whole home outright or with a very substantial down payment. What these maps did was say, is the federal government, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, willing to insure mortgages so that families could put down a much smaller down payment, right? Typical today is 20%, sometimes 10%. And which communities, which neighborhoods were considered quote unquote safe, and which were considered, as you can see, yellow declining, red was considered hazardous. So this term redlining came from the idea that these were the communities in red on all these maps where you would not be able to purchase a home with a federally backed mortgage. What this often meant was that it was very hard for people to sell their home, obviously, and to bring in new families, new investment into these communities. So this often rapidly declined a community because there was no influx of sort of new families moving in and upgrades being done. Lastly are the FHA loans that were given out. So there was a real housing need. And so the federal government had to subsidize builders to sort of mass produce entire subdivisions. One of the most famous ones that gets talked about a lot, or that many people have heard the term of, is Levittown in New York, right? So it was these mass produced subdivisions. However, the federal government actually in their agreement with developers stated that these had to be for whites only. It was required that no homes be sold to African Americans, again, because of some of these underlying ideas from redlining, that these were such unstable and too risky to invest in. And so what you saw were all these communities that were opening up, like Levittown, where only white families were able to purchase in these areas. So another example, and I use this one often because I live in Michigan, and sometimes my students don't know. They know of this wall, but they don't know where it came from or why we have it. So in Michigan, there was actually a development that was wanting to be done, and the federal government said that they would not go ahead with the loan unless the developer first built a 6-foot-high cement wall separating this new development from the local African-American neighborhood. And you see here sort of the original wall that was built, and you see that this wall continues to exist today. And it certainly offers not only, sometimes we have imaginary boundaries between neighborhoods, and here we have actually a very physical boundary between neighborhoods. So, where are we today? So unfortunately, fortunately, so during the 70s and 80s, we actually were making really good progress in school desegregation. And sort of the height of school integration came in the late 80s. And one of the things that I find really interesting is this particular study done by a professor out of the University of California, Berkeley. And what he did was he actually looked at families who were able to take advantage of integration. And in some cases, because families had children that were older and then maybe another set of children that were younger, he could actually compare siblings in the same family. Because one might say, well, some families, maybe they were just more interested in schooling and they just promoted schooling more, and that's why kids did better. And what he actually found was that even when you compared kids who had attended segregated schools and their siblings who had attended integrated schools, those students in integrated schools were more likely to graduate from high school. They're more likely to get out of poverty. And as adults, there's long-lasting consequences for this. They earned more, were less likely to be involved in the criminal justice system, and they actually lived longer. So one might begin to say, well, why would going to an integrated school have such long impacts on children? And one of the things is peer networks, right? Opportunity and information, as well as oftentimes communities come with better resources. So these were really important, and the earlier and longer that children had access to integrated schools, the stronger the results. So despite all this progress that we made, we've really been seeing a retreat from integration, both in housing and in schooling. And what you can see here is, and this stops at 2011, but what you see from the red line is that across all areas, right, it's not just confined to one part of the country. Across all areas in the country, we do see, unfortunately, a rise after this longer period of rapidly declining segregation back towards a resegregation that has been increasing. It is not back to where we were, but certainly it has been continuing to be on the rise. And in some places, people will say that we are back to 1970. So one of the things to think about is, where are we most segregated? And I think a lot of times we often think, well, these are particular places, right? As somebody who grew up only in the North, I often was either told explicitly or implicitly that this was a Southern problem, right? This was not a Northern problem. And yet when you look at this map here, especially this sort of darkish pink color, this most segregated areas, you'll see that many of them are in the North, especially in the Northeast. Yes, there's some on the West Coast as well, and there are some in the South, but it's not always where we expect it to be. So I think it's important to remember that these trends are happening everywhere, unfortunately, and it's not just confined to particular communities that have historically been associated with high levels of segregation. Any questions? I know I'm talking fast. Okay. Want to make sure we have time for questions. So What is fueling today's resegregation? And I don't want to say that school ratings and rankings are the only thing. Certainly, there are many factors that are fueling today's resegregation. But I think that school ratings and rankings play an important role that we really need to be considering. And it's an unintended role. When school ratings were first originally conceived, the idea was that these would really foster a desire to improve. It would motivate schools, motivate teachers who were disappointed with the ratings they got. It would motivate parents to go and complain to their school district and say, hey, why aren't you doing better? You should be doing better. And ultimately, it would enable families to vote with their feet. If they weren't happy with the school and they actually had proof now, it wasn't just a hunch or a concern, they actually had concrete proof that their school was not performing the way that it should be, they could then vote with their feet, take their children and go to a different community. And so you see that as school choice opened up, these ratings became more important, but we have not always just relied on school choice. We've often relied on residential choice as a way to also select our schools. So, what do these scores actually tell us? So first, the vast majority of scores are based on multiple choice tests. And let's remember that from here on out, when I'm talking about school scores, I'm talking about scores on math and reading. Now, I'm sure many of you that have children, many of you that went to school, there was a lot more to your schooling than just math and reading. But what we capture today, partially because it's cheap, partially because we consider those the core basics, and partially because we don't really know how to evaluate in such an easy and cheap way many of the other things that families and kids really value about school. So for example, the arts or the kind of climate and atmosphere in a school, whether or not kids feel like they really belong. All those things are much more difficult to evaluate than just reading and math test scores. And we have invested much more heavily as a country into improving our ability to accurately measure reading and math test scores, though I think we still have a long ways to go. So how do we rate schools? So the first thing we do, that is the first way we did it after releasing test scores became really common, was what's called proficiency scores. So proficiency scores are where a score is set. So there's a given test. Sometimes a group of people get together, sometimes, specialists who specialize in really understanding testing and psychometric evaluations and things will say, here's where a typical fourth grader should be at this time. And so this is the proficiency level. And certainly there are children who will exceed that proficiency level, but we would hope that the vast majority, if not all kids, which was the original goal in 2001, was that all kids would be proficient. And so all children take this same test, regardless of background, home language, resources, outside support, you name it, and all children are expected to achieve this score. So the data that are released when proficiency scores are used are telling you how many or what percent of kids in that building, in that grade, met this benchmark that was sort of externally decided and is considered universal for all children in all places. You can probably imagine, I think there are some flaws with this. So what are the problems with these proficiency scores? Well, often these scores reflect the cumulative opportunities children have had in their families, in their communities, including the opportunity at education when they take the test. And what we know is that schools make a difference. Schools are absolutely important. Kids do not just naturally think up algebra. They need to be taught algebra, right? But we as families and communities also provide a lot of other learning opportunities that shape the sort of knowledge and cumulative knowledge and understandings and ideas that kids have. So things like high quality early childhood opportunities are just so incredibly important for children. Children that have high quality learning opportunities early in life have long lasting consequences for outcomes for these children. There's also family resources. One of the typical measures that a lot of researchers use is just the number of books in a home, because that's a really good predictor of the kinds of interactions that are happening around literacy with kids in a family. So the more books you have in a home, the more likely it is that kids are being exposed to a rich print environment. The kids are talking about books, families are sitting down and reading. Reading might be part of the daily routine. And of course, this is going to improve their reading test scores. Other things like visits to museums, concerts, after school activities, extracurricular activities, music lessons, soccer practice, all these different things that families can provide, coupled with community resources. So some communities have much richer environments for children that provide other learning opportunities outside of the school day. So things like libraries, the number of libraries that have even a children's section and a children's librarian that provides the kinds of learning opportunities, story time, craft activities, all these different kinds of things that a community may provide through a library. Same thing with healthcare availability and quality. We don't often think about the direct relationship with healthcare, but I can tell you from working with kids that one of the main reasons kids miss school is asthma. And so if asthma is not properly treated, kids are often up late at night, they're having a hard time breathing, they're sleepy when they come to school, they may miss school because they're having to deal with these problems. And so just having high quality healthcare can impact, the opportunity a child has to learn. So this means that proficiency scores are much better at measuring a child's background than they are about measuring a child's school. There is a very high relationship between proficiency scores and the race and economic background of the children that are taking the test, or of the school, the overall sort of school composition. Then they really are telling you how good is the education that's happening inside of the building. Most studies kind of come to around about 1/3 of proficiency scores are actually because of what's happening inside of the school. The other 2/3 are because of all these other opportunities to learn and think outside of the school day. I see we've got a number of questions. Erica, do you want to jump in before I keep going any further?
Yes, thank you. The question that we have one person who wanted to say, I was raised in a highly integrated area and finding so much of this info or much of this information, something I was amazingly ignorant about. The other question that we have is, where is the US map with the pink and yellow dots showing the racial segregation? What was the source for that?
I will have to go back and pull that for you. I'm sorry, I don't know it off the top of my head. So
Thank
yeah,
you.
I can get it. Anything else?
Nope, that's all we have so far.
Okay, great. So, and because there are so many problems with proficiency scores, what many educators and test designers have been pushing for, researchers have been pushing for, are for a better score. And I want to make sure that it's really clear that these are better, right? But sometimes better is not good. It's just better than something that's really bad, right? So what's become popular today to talk about are gross scores. So gross scores are a little bit different because they start with a baseline score for a student and then evaluate whether students make gains beyond that initial baseline. So the assumption is that the growth or improvement that you see over time is a better reflection of what schools contribute to a child's learning, where you're trying to sort of isolate just that school contribution. Sometimes schools are scored based on whether students make expected growth. So this is done by evaluating a children's baseline and then saying, well, this is how much this type of kid with this kind of profile, this is how much we think they should grow. And then whether or not or how many kids actually do make that kind of growth. So again, while these scores are better, they do not only reflect what schools contribute. So the idea that we can just get rid of family resources, after school programs, neighborhood opportunities, I think is problematic. These are certainly better. It is getting closer to identifying what schools actually do, but it's really difficult to disentangle these two things of the complex reasons why children learn. So, one of the most popular sites that gets used for these scores is Great Schools. So one of the reasons why private organizations like Great Schools or School Digger or Niche have come to be is because, surprisingly, right, I'm sure you're shocked by this, state and local governments are not very good at communicating this kind of information in a digestible, easy, quick, and easy to understand fashion. And so there was all this data available now, but really convoluted ways to try to make sense of it. So Great Schools started and really had the mission of trying to make these scores understandable to a typical person, easily understandable, and widely available. And so the ratings that they give today are based out of 10. They also color code them. So you kind of see this like red, orange, yellow, green, right? Which again gives you a very quick signal as to whether or not a school is good or bad. So how does Great Schools come up with the ratings that they use? So Great Schools has made efforts to try to reflect the need to incorporate growth. So several years ago, they started to try to combine multiple measures rather than relying solely on proficiency. And this is the sort of set of data that they use to come up with their overall score. So you can see here they use growth, and it is the largest percent, though it's still just 36%. They use proficiency, right, as 19%, college readiness, which is 20%. And again, this would only be for high schools. And I'm not exactly sure how they rate that. And then they have an equity rating, and their equity rating is based on how well children compare to wealthy children compare to low income kids in that school, or how Black kids compare to white kids in that school. So while I really want to recognize Great Schools' efforts to try to tackle this problem, they are trying to be responsive because they have recognized that the use of their data has actually contributed to the resegregation that we see happening, because other sites like Niche and School Digger just continue to rely on proficiency. But let me give you a few caveats about the scores that they're using. The first is that growth is not available in all states. And so there are some states for which there is no data available, so then they have to rely only on proficiency. The second thing is, in places where you have racially and economically isolated schools, so if you have an all Latino or an all African American school, there's no way to get an equity rating because you can't compare how white kids are doing to Black kids in that school. So what they do then is they rely on an average equity rating of growth and proficiency scores. And so schools can kind of end up getting almost doubly dinged when they are a predominantly African-American or a predominantly low-income school, because that other rating is still factoring in and sort of filling in this 26%. So proficiency, and then if it's an elementary school, obviously all these things go up. So proficiency can in some cases actually begin to count for a bigger part than this reflects. This is sort of best case scenario data available. I also want to say that like everything these days, I feel like this is just a cliche statement. COVID is making this much more complicated. And while I think they were improving, I worry that for several years to come, our test scores are going to be even more impacted by inequities. So schools, we know that schools were more likely to offer in-person education for particular communities than in other communities. We know that some places made good efforts to give tests to all kids. Other places, kids just were really erratically coming to school because it was very difficult to come to school under COVID conditions with families working and all these different kinds of things. So while this was better, I think that what we're going to see over the next few years is that we may not even have growth data to work with. We may not even have proficiency data to work with. And so what these scores mean for the next several years is going to be even more difficult to understand and convey because COVID made testing so complicated. So what do we know about, imperfect though they are, and now hopefully you know a little bit about where they come from, how are they actually getting used? So who uses them and how? So we know that Zillow and its affiliated sites count for more than 150 million unique visitors to Great Schools site each month. So the fact that when you go to Zillow and it's sort of right there, it's been made very easy to connect to, people are really using this information. So on the one hand, maybe that's great. Everybody's got more information. There are some people who really believe, information, the more the better. But you also can see that this is really driving people to increasingly use these and to potentially value them. So if I see this come up, I might, whereas before I might not have thought about it, I might say, oh, this must be a really important part to my housing search. I might really need to think about this and what this means as I choose where I want to live. So, one of the things that is important that great schools will often say is their goal is to democratize information. They will tell you, and I believe them, that they really are trying to empower low-income families, families that typically do not have access to information, to be able to use information to make better choices for their children. Great Schools has partnered with listing sites that focus specifically just on housing vouchers, right? So Section 8 vouchers for families, which are only available for low-income families. So they really are making good faith efforts. But research also shows, and it's quite limited, again, it's very hard to disentangle, that knowledge is power, but often only for the powerful. So in one of the studies that I think is better done, and this is a backwards looking study. So it does not capture the most recent changes that Great Schools has made towards incorporating more growth measures. So this is looking more at the use of proficiency measures. Was that affluent and better educated families were better positioned to sort of leverage this information to purchase in communities with the best schools. So they were the families who both had the education and the social networks and the skills to know how to use this data. And then they also had the financial capital to be able to be choosy, to be able to say, no, I will only look in, this neighborhood or this community because of the school district. So as a result, school performance ratings actually accelerated rather than reduced sort of economic divergence between neighborhoods. So after ratings were introduced, neighborhoods with lower performing schools lost higher income and more college educated residents, as well as white and Asian residents. And then the reverse is true. So those that had high performing schools saw more white, Asian, higher education, higher income families moving into them. So you begin to see this sort of pulling apart of the different kinds of communities. What you'll see, and I have read, and some people try to put a dollar amount on what sort of premium families and home buyers are willing to pay for a home in a particular school district. And I will say that those exact dollar amounts, I'm very wary of how accurate they are. You probably know even better than I do that trying to figure out the compilation of what a house is worth is just like what makes a child learn is a composition of a ton of different things. The value of a home is related to many different things. So I'm very hesitant about the exact dollar figure. However, I do believe, and I've heard from enough real estate agents in my interviews with them, that many families really are willing to pay a premium for the right school or the right school district. So what I heard from realtors was that buyers often come to you with pre-existing ideas about where they're willing to look. Some go so far as to say, I will only look in this school district area, or sometimes even down to the school. So I will only look in neighborhoods that are zoned to this particular school because it is a 9 or a 10. Some will say explicitly, I will only look in places where it's a 9 or a 10. And then you also have the other side of it is that sellers, or people who are, even if they don't have children and thinking about where will my kids go, they may be thinking about, well, what's the resale value of my home? And is the resale value going to be higher, or is it going to be more stable in places where the school districts are rated more highly? And I heard all the time that buyers are asking real estate agents, is this a good school? Is this a good district? One of the things that often happens is, buyers with good intentions try to offer up advice, try to offer up their knowledge. Often for people who are relocating, you're kind of at the mercy of what you're telling me because I don't know these communities, I don't know these neighborhoods. And so it can become really tricky in the ways that schools and their ratings become proxies for race and class in ways that you wouldn't necessarily say, oh, this is a safe neighborhood because it's wealthy. But when you say this is a good school because it has good test scores, you are in effect often saying the same thing, and it gets a little bit tricky. And so sometimes these school ratings have inadvertently become the way that we are steering both economically and racially parents to different communities, home buyers to different communities. Should I check in for questions?
We have one comment. My
Okay.
daughter, or we have one person who says real estate agent here, and yes. And then the other comment is, my daughter is in a school that is part of a very affluent neighborhood, which has very high scores for testing. What these scores don't show is how many of these families pay and engage tutors. The scores make the school look like it is doing a great job. It's hard to know if it is, or if the families who supplement, or if it is the families who supplement the learning.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly, that just summarizes with a great example of how difficult it is to disentangle the role of family and community from what the school is doing. How many of us, when our kids come home, we say, I'm not reading to you, I'm not talking to you, I'm not going to take you anywhere. Of course we continue. And when they ask us questions, we engage them, we answer them, we try to provide examples. We do many things that engage our children in outside of school learning opportunities. And the tutoring piece, as somebody who, since I was going to graduate school in New York City, and graduate student life is not a rich life, I did a lot of tutoring on the Upper East Side for private school kids. And I often wondered, what a racket. They're paying $40,000 a year for private school, and then they're paying me $100 an hour to tutor their kids. And I would think if I was paying that much, the school should do their job, but it just became such a competition for more. So yeah. All right, so let's spend our remaining time talking about what we could do that might be different. So first off, I personally would prefer that we not use test scores. As I mentioned before, they are such a limited slice of why we educate our children. Test scores really only tell us about math and reading. And I think many of us, when we walk into a school, that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for just a huge variety of things. What does the place feel like? Do teachers and the administration know my kid's name? Do they know who I am? Or is there artwork? Are things clean? Is it well decorated? Is there work on the walls that shows kids are engaging at all different levels of thinking? Are kids outside playing games? Does my kid like going to school? For many of us, just the fact that they will go happily in the morning is probably the most important thing to how we feel about our school. And yes, we want them to learn academic skills, but we don't want them to learn just reading and math skills. We want them to learn to get along with each other. We want them to think critically, and critical thinking is a very hard thing to evaluate on a multiple choice test. And so these ratings are limited in what they really tell you about a robust education. And then on top of that, they're limited in what they tell you about what the school is actually adding to that education, because they are so often really tangled up with historical opportunity, race, and class today. But if you or a buyer must use school ratings, I would really encourage you to look at the growth rating. That takes a little bit more work because you have to actually not just look at what pops up first, you have to go sort of into their click down, investigate more. And as I'm sure you know, many people, the homepage is as far as they get. So trying to get a little bit further is not always an easy task. The other thing is there are alternatives to school, the great schools information. And I always think it's really interesting when I read the history of great schools. It originally started with the guy who created it visiting schools and asking school leaders to share, like, what's great about your school? What would you want people to know about your school or district? They were trying to let the schools and districts speak for themselves. There have been other efforts to try to do this through real estate agents coming together. So there's a Quad City project in Iowa that tried to do this, of trying to say, let's ask the district to tell us about themselves. And then that's the information that we will share. So we're not generating the information. We're not endorsing the information. We're saying, here are the school districts and here's what they would tell you about themselves. School district websites are notoriously awful. They're sort of stuck in the 90s, especially some don't have the resources to be able to update them all the time with the most current and latest, greatest information. And yet there might be really great things going on at the school. Another that some of you may be familiar with or have heard of is like a district partnership. So Pasadena Public Schools a number of years ago, as the story goes, was hiring a new superintendent. And the superintendent of the Pasadena Public School system obviously needed a new home. So he started with a real estate agent who said to him, oh, you don't want to look in Pasadena because those schools aren't very good, not knowing that he was going to become the leader of this school system. I have certainly had those whoops moments, so we all do it. Anyways, this got him sort of started thinking about, where do these ideas come from about the school system and how can we change them? And one of the things that they found was that the ideas about the school system were sort of stuck in the past and that there had been lots of changes. And I'm sure you're familiar with this too, that neighborhoods get reputations, schools get reputations, and they get passed on and sort of the name lives on long beyond what actually created that reputation in the first place. And so Pasadena Public Schools, their foundation, which is started by the school board, worked with the real estate board in their area to offer trainings. And they went so far as to create an endorsement that realtors could put on their website that said, I'm a specialist in schools. And so certainly for many families, this is something that really appealed to them. I have talked to different real estate agents about this idea, and some are more or less comfortable with it, but I offer it as a way of thinking creatively about how you could work with your local school districts, and they might love to provide the training for you. They do a training where they actually bring the real estate agents to the school. They do some school tours. They have kids come and talk to them about their, what they like about their school. And they found out in Pasadena that there were all these great bilingual opportunities that many parents, many wealthier parents were dying to take a part of. They didn't even know that they were available. And when they learned that, they were much more interested in the Pasadena public schools, despite the fact that maybe their great schools rating was still a 6. The other thing that was new to me, I went and I learned from talking to folks like yourself, are these love letters to the seller. And I did not know of these. And I was surprised when I heard about it, the ways that that would create such bias towards selling to somebody like me, right? We love our homes. These homes they're not just where we go at night. They are a representation of ourselves. They are where our kids grew up, where we have memories, all these kinds of things. And so when we, are engaged in this process of choosing a buyer, some of these love letters are going to speak to us in ways that are biased because they're like me. Oh, I remember being, a young couple just starting out, and look, they're just like me. And they talk about how, they've got 1 2-year-old. Our kid was 2 when we moved into this house. And, we can end up replicating, because of the historical bias that I talked about, we can end up inadvertently replicating that bias because we sell to people like ourselves. So the community continues to look like it has for multiple generations. So maybe it's not purposeful segregation today, but the historical segregation lives on, unfortunately. So I would really encourage, I've heard some sellers and buyers say that they will tell their clients that I do not do this. I know that might mean losing clients, but it might also be something you'd be willing to think about as a way of just trying to not replicate the bias in the same kind of way. So I'd like to sort of stop here now. I think I'm doing pretty good on time. We've got some time for questions, comments, other ideas. What would you say kind of questions that maybe we can discuss?
Yeah, and Oregon recently had a law that passed banning love letters, and then there was an injunction on it. And we haven't heard if what's happening with the injunction. It might be permanent. So we're in an interesting space talking about love letters. So for everyone on the webinar, I just posted the link to Oregon Realtors guidance on love letters and you can read through that, but it is pretty much in alignment with what Rebecca was just talking about. And it does cover some of the topics to avoid if you do have a seller that wants, or a buyer who really wants to do a love letter. Thank you. One of the questions that came up was, any chance I could get the contact information for someone involved in the Pasadena project? I'm located in the Bay Area and think it could help a lot of agents. Thank you. I would also love that information.
Sure.
We've got someone else who says, I also tell my buyers, I don't know what makes a good school for you and your family. I recommend they visit the school and see how it feels, not just depend on the online scoring. And then Laurel, who's part of our diversity committee, brought up, I'm particularly interested in learning more about the possible ways to partner with school districts with the training and endorsements that can result. One of the things that has been in conversation in our diversity committee is possibly putting together some sort of survey or some sort of tool for schools to talk about themselves in a way that isn't test scores. And we're at the beginning stage of that conversation because we want to be really cautious of the Department of Education here in Oregon and making sure that we're not stepping on any toes. We are not survey development experts. We're going to have to partner, but that is a conversation that we've been having, and we'd love to hear some of your insight on that and this district partnership piece.
Yeah, so I have had a chance to have a conversation with one of the trainers in Pasadena, as well as school board members that were the originators of sort of setting this up. And I do think they are a wealth of information, and they shared many things with me very freely. So I'd be happy to be able to provide those contexts. Um, what I found most interesting was that in some ways it really was school district led, but that realtors really appreciated this information, right? So sort of back to that idea of like, I grew up here and I sort of just had these ideas from when I was a kid and I still think that way. And then when I see it, it's so different. So I think one of the pieces that they have stressed is the importance of visiting. Now that's not always possible, but that, you know, the sort of old adage of seeing is believing can be really important, especially to shake when we don't even realize we hold them, sort of these preconceived notions. And then we see it and we're like, oh, I didn't even realize I assumed this, right? I assumed the building still looked the way it did when I was a kid, right? I didn't realize they had completely renovated and upgraded and done all these different kinds of things, right? So sometimes that seeing is believing piece is really one thing that they stressed. They So the school district was actually the one providing the training, and then it was the real estate board that was providing the credits like you were talking about at the beginning of this, as well as this sort of endorsement seal thing that some people felt was a nice thing to have. And some of the training wasn't just about here's what's great about Pasadena schools, but here's what you should know to ask about schools. So similar to the comment that you received of like, I don't know what's a good school for you, you know, ways to talk about schooling, you know, language to use that is more robust than just test scores. And so some real estate agents found that to be really helpful, just to sort of get their head around the lingo of schools and what do these different terms mean and what does it mean if I use them, and how can I talk about education as much more than just reading and math. I don't know if that answered all the questions, but
It
maybe.
did. No, that was very helpful. Thank you. So, and I hear you saying school district and led. I think that's a really important piece to this. I have ideas spinning already of who I want to be reaching out to and how I want to do this. All right. There is a question. Is this recorded and can we get a copy? This is recorded and will be available in online ed. If you are already registered for the webinar, or if you know somebody who registered for the webinar and wasn't able to access it, they can email education at Oregon Realtors and we can get them set up so they can access that recording. If anybody else wants to watch it, it is for purchase and online ed. Let's see. Somebody else said, this is amazing. Thank you. Somebody else said, what are conversations around communities with shrinking student populations, schools losing funding because there's not as many kids in that particular school district?
So, you know, certainly, there are many places, as you know, people sort of relocate that, and here in Michigan, especially the shrinking school districts just face a tremendous challenge because you don't just lose kids from third grade, so you can cut one third grade teacher. Unfortunately, your numbers decline across all the grades, but that doesn't mean you can, you know, just eliminate a classroom here or eliminate a classroom there. So a lot of times your operating costs remain the same despite your revenues going down because quote, you know, revenues, it sounds terrible because I'm talking about children, but you know, the number of children that you have in the building is going down. The other thing that's impacting, and this is again a little bit of a, maybe it was just a COVID blip, but I talked to some real estate agents that were in places where very wealthy families were buying second homes, right? Vacation homes, getaway homes, you know, get to nature, not be quite so crowded environment homes. And that certainly has an impact too on who's investing in the schools, right? How do they view their schools? And some of the superintendents that I've spoken to in rural parts of Michigan that have this phenomenon happening have talked about the ways that the district is trying to offer community events so that non-residents, but who are there for a couple of months a year, sort of see what the schools are doing and become appreciative of and see the schools as part of the amenities of the community, not just the great beaches and the lakes and the nice restaurants and the cute downtown shopping area, that they begin to see the schools as that too. It's a little bit of a separate conversation from the test score piece, but I think it's another important way that housing and schools become really linked, and that many district and school leaders are thinking about. We've got a lot of people we have to cater to.
Yeah. Thank you for that. We have another comment, and please, again, feel free to ask questions. We have about 6 more minutes left for questions. Wonderful class. Thank you. As a former teacher for 30 years and a realtor, I value your expertise. And that is from Brenda Myers. We'll give it another minute or two for any last questions.
So, another possible idea that's that we've talked about are, again, your local organization, whether or not realtors would say pay. So if the local organization collects the data and then realtors pay a fee to access these alternative sources of information, right? Then again, it's not having to be done by each individual realtor or each individual agency, but that if there was more of a coordinated way that, people could pay into a common source that then provided, that got updated every once in a while, because this is not a small undertaking to keep up with things that are happening in the schools, right? Schools are always trying to offer something new and exciting. And so, is there a more coordinated way that a centralized place could gather this information? Resources could be, everybody chips in, resources are available then to have somebody who sort of periodically does the kind of survey or visit or phone call to just sort of say, hey, what is going on? And then puts it together in a fashion so that every school or district looks similar, right? So you sort of have common boxes that get filled in so that you, again, remove any bias from the agents, from the school district that's able to provide you with mounds of information versus the school district that's like, I can barely keep up with the mound of paperwork. And that kind of goes back to smaller districts that have less resources and less personnel to be able to draw on that kind of thing. So that's just another thought too of how to manage this in a reasonable way.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that insight. That's great. I know that this will be, it's top of the agenda for our next diversity committee meeting, and I'm very excited to dive into this a bit more. We have some partners throughout the state that we're going to be reaching out to this week to get in on that. And for our members who are not part of the diversity committee, you're always welcome to tune in to diversity committee meetings during our spring and fall governance. And applications will be going out at the end of this week for committee work if you want to sign up next time. Thank you so much, Rebecca. It looks like we don't have any other questions.
Okay.
This was a fantastic presentation. Laurel says, so amazing. So thankful you joined us, and a huge thanks to Oregon Realtors for making this possible. Thank you, Laurel, for this topic recommendation. Also, really appreciate that connection. So, Rebecca, it was lovely having you, and I look forward to connecting with you further on this. And thank you to all of our members who attended. A quick reminder, if you are registered for this event, you will be getting CE. I'm gonna steal the screen share real quickly.
Yep. Sorry, I guess I should have done that.
All right. I just wanted to share some of the upcoming classes we have for you. We have Discovering Commercial Real Estate, Basics of Market Analysis and Investment in Commercial Real Estate, and GRI negotiations back in person at Eugene Realtors on May 18th. So those are the upcoming classes. And don't forget to follow us on all your favorite social media outlets. That we post a lot of our classes and events there as well. So you can, as well as tips and tricks for everything you do. So follow us there, and we look forward to connecting with you further. Rebecca, thank you so much again. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for giving me all of your time. And I really am happy to follow up with anybody if you want to just email me directly.
Okay. Thank you, Rebecca. We really appreciate that. And I will I took lots of great notes, and we will send out the slide deck to everyone who attended so that they have access to those notes as well. Thank you. All right, everyone, enjoy the rest of your morning.
Thanks.